Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today to join in this webinar and the discussion we'd like to have today. Before we start, I'd like to recognize that Carleton University and myself personally are located on the territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, who've been the guardians of this land for countless years and who have never ceded the right for settlers to inhabit and use this land. So it's important that we recognize that, and more than that, that we all try to find ways to work on truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in ways that help to sustain this land and to work in solidarity with Indigenous people to address the ongoing impacts of colonialism. So keeping that in mind, my name is Jane Stinson, and I'm the chair of the advisory board of the Institute of Political Economy's Work and Labor Program, which organized this webinar. I bring regrets from Justin Paulson, who's the chair of the Institute of Political Economy, who's unfortunately unable to join us today. Justin, like possibly others here, was affected by the power outage, and in fact, he does not have any power yet. So best wishes to him and everyone else who's affected in that way. So I'd just like to give a few thanks and a bit of background before turning it over to our moderator today. I'd like to thank Tabitha Mullen, who's the Institute Administrator and who worked with me today to organize this event and does so much to organize the Institute and the Work and Labor Program. And I'd also like to thank our moderator, Ania I knew I would have trouble, Zbyszewska, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton, and who's also on the advisory board for the Work and Labor Program. And finally, I'd like to thank our panelists today, Taylor, Katya, and Andrea. And I'm going to leave it to Ania to introduce them to you. But first, I just wanted to say a little bit about why we organized today's webinar and one that preceded it. And that is that we want to showcase research that's being done by students in the Work and Labor Program. And secondly, we want to bring some of the conversations that are happening in our classrooms into a broader community to discuss important current issues affecting precarious workers in particular, talk about why this is happening and how do we address these problems involving people who are on the ground working on these issues. So we have that wonderful mix here today. And thirdly, we want you to know about this Work and Labor Program. It's pretty new still. We're just sort of getting going, and we would really like you to help spread the word about it and consider registering for it so that the program can grow and thrive and have more conversations like the one we're going to have today. The Work and Labor Program attracts full-time workers and students. It's flexible. There's a lot of scope for you to examine the topics that are of greatest concern to you. And registration for the fall diploma is open until late August. We'll share a link to the program website in the chat for those who are interested. So today, we're really happy to hear Taylor Maudlin's research on why sexual harassment is so prevalent for female wait staff. I know Taylor's reflecting on her own experience, which is, again, one of the things we're hoping that this program can allow people to do. And then we'll ask Kaitlyn from the Victoria BC Workers Centre and Andrea from Unite here in Toronto to share their thoughts and strategies about how to counter sexualized violence and precarity in the service industry. So Ania, who so kindly offered to moderate today's webinar, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. And I would like to also echo Jane's welcome and thank you all for joining our discussion today. As Jane already mentioned, our subject is sexual harassment at work. a risk that is far too prevalent despite being regulated by occupational health and safety and human rights regulatory regimes here in Ontario, but also in other provinces. And crucially, workers who are engaged in frontline and service sectors, many of whom are women and racialized, are more likely to experience sexual harassment at work. And this is in part due to their social location, and in part due to ways in which the sectors in which they are overrepresented, such as restaurants and broader hospitality industry, how those sectors are organized. And as we'll learn from today's discussion, I'm anticipating, the precariousness and elevated risks that these workers experience are structurally and legally produced rather than inevitable. And we're really lucky today to have a wonderful group of speakers to help us unpack the ways in which gendered codes, power relations, and specific sectoral practices interact to produce precariousness and heightened risks of sexual harassment, but also to consider how workers can, and in fact already do, challenge and resist these through collective action. And so before we proceed with today's session, or discussion, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists, and I will do this in alphabetical order, which is not the order in which they will later go, but I'll explain all of that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrea Babinton, who is the president of the Toronto and New York Region Labor Council and the first Black woman to hold this position. An activist, organizer, and a long-term shop steward at Unite Here, Local 75, Andrea has considerable experience representing and advocating for workers in service industries, primarily in hotel and hospitality sectors. Andrea has led multiple campaigns, and she has frequently spoken up against sexual harassment in her sector. Next, we have Caitlyn Matulevich, who is an activist and a scholar and a former colleague of mine. She is executive director of Workers' Solidarity Network, which is an organization based in Victoria, British Columbia. Kaitlyn has researched, written extensively, and spoken on social and legal organization of waitressing work, and as precarious work and sexual harassment in the sector in particular. In addition to academic writing, Kaitlyn has published various policy notes and op-eds, and as I already said, she is an activist. Last but not least, we have Taylor Maudlin, who is an MA student or master student at Carleton University in the Pauline Jewett Institute of Women's and Gender Studies, and she's also enrolled in the Work and Labor Graduate Diploma. Taylor has written and recently presented a paper on sexual harassment in waitressing work, which really, as Jane already noted, gave us the prompt to organize this session and to invite both Andrea and Kaitlyn to contribute to discussion by bringing in their considerable activist expertise to the discussion. So because Taylor and her paper were the prompt for this session, we will begin with her today. She will speak for 12 to 15 minutes or so, and her presentation is entitled "The Customer is Not Always Right: Sexual Harassment and Consent in Waitressing." Then we will move to Kaitlyn and Andrea to comment on Taylor's presentation and share their insights on how best to respond to the problems that Taylor is going to outline in her remarks. And again, they'll be drawing on their activist expertise. And we plan on reserving about 30 minutes for Q&A and general discussion at the end of today's session. So please hold your comments until then, but of course, feel free to place them in the chat during the presentations, and we will most certainly come to them during the Q&A. So Taylor, the floor is yours to begin.
Thank you, Ania, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, can we all see that? Okay. Okay. So as Ania said, the The title of my presentation is "The Customer is Not Always Right, Sexual Harassment and Consent in Waitressing." So my thesis research focuses on women's experiences in the food service industry based on my own experience for a few years working in that industry. And this presentation is based on a research paper I wrote last year for a law and legal studies course. So to give you an overview of my paper, I argue that sexual harassment is prevalent in the food service industry. This is amplified by the sexualized environment of the restaurant, where sexual jokes and innuendos among coworkers are commonplace. This sexualization does not only occur among coworkers, but from customers. So due to the view that the customer is always right, sexual harassment from customers is normalized in the food service industry. This muddles lines of consent, the definition of which varies according to different Canadian legislation. When sexualization is part of the normal workplace relations in the restaurant, sexual harassment can be difficult to report. The majority of food service workers are women, and 1 in 5 young Canadians aged 24 or under are employed in the restaurant industry. This industry is the #1 source of first-time jobs for young workers. So this underscores the importance of calling attention to this unique issue of sexual harassment in order to prevent it. To provide a little bit of background, I will use the term food service industry frequently. And in this industry, I'm specifically referring to full service restaurants that offer face-to-face service and involve the mechanism of tipping. And using the gender term waitress, I do so to provide linguistic clarity, as well as to call attention to the prevalence of sexual harassment against women in this sector. So sexual harassment is frequent in the food service industry. One Fair Wage found that 71% of American women restaurant workers had been sexually harassed during their time in the industry. Because waitresses in both the US and Canada rely on tips to supplement their income, they may feel the need to play into these sexualized instances in order to gain more tips. So the analytical lens I use throughout my paper is feminist political economy. Scholars of feminist political economy have demonstrated how precarious jobs defined by low income, lack of control, declining unionization rates, and limited access to regulatory protection are particularly common among women, migrant, and racialized workers. The reason that I use feminist political economy is because it allows for a nuanced understanding of the meaning of women's work and an examination of the way that historical divisions and social locations may affect the order of work. Feminist political economy views the state as contested terrain, where omitting historically based inequalities in labor law may harm vulnerable employees the laws were intended to protect. Feminist political economy also allows for industry-specific solutions and advocates for providing holistic legislation that takes gendered and racialized divisions into consideration. In addition to examinations that point to the restaurant environment as a sexualized space, there is a historical foundation of the presence of gender divisions. Service sector jobs are often considered extensions of women's traditional domestic roles, leading to restaurants framing service work as women's work by creating gender divisions and hiring gendered workers to fill them. Servers are often treated as sexual objects through being encouraged to wear revealing uniforms or more makeup, flirt with customers, and accept harassment and sexual joking from coworkers and customers alike. So how do we define sexual harassment? According to the Canadian Criminal Code, sexual harassment is engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct that is known or ought to be known as unwelcome. This establishes both a subjective and objective test for harassment, the subjective component being the harasser's own knowledge of how their behavior has been received, while the objective component positions a reasonable third party that must take into consideration the perspective of the person who was harassed. However, in sexualized work environments such as the restaurant, sexual joking and conduct are used to determine normal social relations at work, which makes it difficult to pinpoint when the behavior crosses the line to become unwelcome. So why focus on the food service industry? This sector has unique laws due to the reliance on tipping. In the US, employees may be paid as little as $2.13 an hour, as long as they make $30 in tips a month. This is known as the sub-minimum wage. In Canada, a tip differential existed until recently in British Columbia and Ontario, and it still persists in Quebec. Because the vast majority of food and beverage workers are women, the wage tip is a gendered economic practice validated by labor law. Qualitative data has indicated that waitresses may feel the need to tolerate whatever a customer does to them because the customer is the one funding their wages rather than the employer. And again, the food service industry is characterized by a young workforce. Young workers are vulnerable to this type of harassment as they are more likely to have a limited understanding of sexual harassment policies and procedures. Consent, as defined by the Canadian Criminal Code, is the voluntary agreement to engage in the sexual activity in question. Waitresses may consent to serving customers and may even consent to flirting or dressing a certain way to gain tips. The lines of consent become blurred when waitresses rely on customers to fund their wages, creating a power dynamic that may pressure them to tolerate sexual harassment. When the state is the one who decides what constitutes harm and further consent, this puts the onus on determining what is consent and what counts as sexual harassment on waitresses themselves. So the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Occupation Health and Safety Act are two pieces of legislation intended to mitigate instances of sexual harassment. Both pieces of legislation rely on the standard of reasonableness to determine what counts as sexual harassment, where conduct is known or should reasonably be known to be unwanted. This is complicated in the restaurant industry, as the standard of reasonableness may fail to take into consideration the gendered order of workplaces. This leads to the questions: if the customer is always right, how can they be held responsible for their conduct? Where is the line of consent drawn in service interactions? And finally, when most of the legislation on workplace sexual harassment is intended for coworkers, what recourse exists for waitresses who experience sexual harassment and feel as though they need to deal with it to earn money? So returning to the mechanism of tipping, the power dynamic between customer and waitress is upheld when the customer holds the power to decide if there will be a tip. Waitresses may be less likely to come forward if they are harassed, as this could affect the amount they are tipped. Managers may also influence experiences of sexual harassment by intervening in sexual harassment committed among coworkers, but being complicit in normalizing harassment from customers. One Fair Wage found that tipped workers are more likely to be harassed than their non-tipped counterparts. Tipped workers were also less likely to say that the situation was corrected by management. 48% of tipped workers identified their sexual harassers as customers, compared to 26% of non-tipped workers. So Good and Cooper conducted a series of interviews with service sector workers on customer-based sexual harassment. They found that few companies have specific policies preventing customer-perpetrated sexual harassment. Further, the nature of service work makes it difficult for employees to define boundaries between customer service and unwanted attention. Employees weren't sure if their complaints were serious enough, and the power that customers exerted over employees made them feel intimidated, humiliated, and hesitant to complain to managers. Employee responses were generally informal in that they did not involve filing a written complaint or meeting outside of the workplace. Waitresses would often deal with the harassment by rationalizing the behavior as happening to many coworkers and not particular to the person receiving the harassment. Overall, Good and Cooper's findings suggest that the burden of responsibility for responding and mediating instances of sexual harassment is largely placed individually onto workers in the service sector. In looking at research for similar industries, a 2018 survey distributed to hotel managers in the southern US found that the same sexually harassing behavior was perceived less negatively when it was done by a customer than by a coworker. The authors theorized that this could be due to relying on customer satisfaction and the need to appease customers at any cost. The authors also attest that when coming forward with a complaint may directly impact a waitress's wage, it is on the organization to prevent such behavior. So the restaurant industry is one in which sexual harassment occurs more frequently due to factors such as the organizational climate, precarious work, and little knowledge about sexual harassment policies. Possible solutions to address this include ending the sub-minimum wage, which would reduce the unequal power dynamic between customers and waitresses, and relieve the pressure of relying on consumer subjectivity to aid in funding wages. More employer accountability is needed, and that means ensuring that sexual harassment training addresses manager responsibility in preventing and dealing with sexual harassment from customers. This training should also include clear outlines for how employees should manage sexual harassment from customers and how they can go about reporting it. This would also lead to more employee awareness of sexual harassment policies, which is integral to preventing this type of harassment. Industry-specific sexual harassment laws are needed. The standard of reasonableness used to determine what counts as sexual harassment may not be comprehensive enough for gendered industries in the service and care sectors. Understanding that the customer may not always be right is a start in naming this issue and bringing awareness to it. So thank you, that's my presentation. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Taylor, thank you so much for this presentation. And I know that Kaitlyn has done a lot of research in this area. And in fact, in your paper and in your presentation, you have referred to her work. And specifically, I know Kaitlyn has done work around the relationship between wage tipping and sexual harassment. So it's really quite wonderful that you get to interact with Kaitlyn on this panel and that we get to hear from her as well. And Kaitlyn, I also know that you have, one of the reasons perhaps for your interest in this area is that, like Taylor herself, you've also done some work. Your first jobs, in a sense, were also in the restaurant industry. So I will give the floor to you now to perhaps tell us how the experiences or the situation that Taylor is sort of setting out in her paper and in her presentation, how that resonates maybe with the situation in British Columbia, where you are located, and also where most of your research focused on, but also your activist work as well. But feel free to speak to whatever. But those are it struck me as the fact that there may be an interesting sort of comparison to be made between the two jurisdictions. Thanks.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Ania, and to everyone who helped organize this webinar. It's great to be here, and also to meet you, Taylor, another former restaurant worker who turned to academia for an outlet to explore these such important and significant and ongoing problems in the industry. I'm calling in from the unceded territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, also known as Victoria, BC. And yeah, I have a few comments to make about the topic and your presentation, Taylor. And then also I wanted to share some of the activist work that the Worker Solidarity Network does, and then specifically in relation to, addressing gender and sexism and sexual harassment in the industry. Some of the community-based work that the WSN has done. Starting off with some comments. That was a really fabulous presentation, Taylor. And I think the time span of the literature, I was looking at your slides and the dates, and this time span of the literature that you draw on, it signifies how this has been such an important problem for quite some time. It's really ongoing, and it's, even though in the early 1980s, we had the first case laws in Canada or the first cases to establish sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination, it's still ongoing today. And like you said, normalized in the industry. I think a real strength of your research is highlighting, a number of different systemic factors at play that work to all come together and create this environment that perpetuates sexual harassment, specifically from customers. And when I was reading your paper that Ania sent me beforehand, and also listening to your presentation, I was thinking about the work of a sociologist named Joan Acker, who came up with this term called inequality regimes. And Acker defined these regimes as, quote, loosely interrelated practices, processes, actions, and meanings that result in and maintain class, gender, and racial inequalities within particular organizations. And Acker said that these regimes are fluid and changing, and they're also linked to inequality that we see in society more broadly. And Acker said that, you know, these regimes, they can be challenged and changed, but first they need to be made visible. And your presentation and your work really does that. It makes the concrete visible so that we can examine them, you know, identify them, and then think about how to dismantle them and how to reorganize and restructure the world of work so that sexual harassment isn't normalized. And yeah, a few comments to pick up on some of the points you made in your presentation, a key one being gender, and the theme of how gendered power relations are structuring restaurant work, as well as class and race. And, you know, your use of feminist political economy is really crucial to understanding that broader picture. And as you highlighted in one of your slides, you know, gender and the gender division of labor in restaurants, with predominantly women in the front of house, men working in the back of house, is a consequence of gendered hiring practices. And I remember from my own interviews speaking to restaurant workers, and many of them recalled, you know, management being very open about the fact that, you know, they wouldn't hire women to work in kitchens, and they wouldn't hire men to work in the front of house. And that was just the way it is. And hiring practices in the restaurant industry, of course, aren't just gendered, but they're also shaped by race. And these decisions, you know, perpetuate racial and economic inequality. And I know you made use of her work in your presentation too. Saruja Yaraman from the United States and the co-founder of Rock United has drawn attention to the fact that racialized hiring practices in the restaurant industries that lead to white workers typically working as bartenders or servers in the more lucrative positions, and higher end restaurants as well, means that at the same time, behind the quote kitchen door, workers of color and migrant workers are predominantly based. And these positions are often the lower paying jobs, like dishwashers, and positions that have less respect or are on like the lower end of the hierarchy in the restaurant industry too. So race is a huge factor that shapes hiring practices in the industry as well, and perpetuates inequality. Another contributing factor to, you know, how sexual harassment gets normalized, and like the title of your paper identifies, is this mindset that the customer is always right, and it, you know, underlies service and customer interactions. I remember from my own experience having that drilled into my head that you have to make sure that the customer leaves happy, because once they leave, they're going to share that experience with their friends. If it's a negative experience, they're not going to come back. And that was just, you know, like the dominant messaging from my training, I remember, of working in the industry. And, you know, this mindset influences how workers experience and handle and react to customer behavior that is unacceptable. You know, having to smile through rude customer remarks or sexist remarks, or feeling that pressure to do so because of this, you know, this strong mindset. And of course, we see, you know, how the customer is always right framing, and the power that it has behind it is not just, you know, what am I trying to say here? It has a material backing to it, right? A very direct consequence if it's not followed, because of the threat of customers not tipping workers. And the tipping system and you said in your paper how in British Columbia, the liquor server wages is now abolished. It used to be in 2011, the Liberal government introduced the liquor server minimum wage that was in place up until last year in June. And it was the tip differential the tip was recognized in the wage with a differential wage for liquor servers. And when it was first introduced, it was a smaller gap, and it grew to, I think, about $1.50 gap. And not only being a material of material significance and shaping the income of workers, but I think it was also very symbolic. And it was, example of labor law recognizing the role of customers in paying workers, which of course is a job that is a responsibility that's usually reserved for employers. So we don't have that in BC anymore, the liquor server minimum wage. The NDP government finally phased it out after recommendations from the Fair Wages Commission here in BC, but workers still rely on customers for tips because minimum wage $15.20 here in BC is still far below a living wage of $20, approximately $20. It varies depending on the specific region in BC, but it's about $5 less than a living wage, which means workers still need those tips and still rely on customers to supplement their income. And then, of course, there's other factors as well at play that shape the work to be precarious. Anyone who's worked in the industry, knows, and I'm sure many folks in joining this webinar have worked in the industry, but know that, for example, if you show up for your shift and it's very dead in the restaurant, it's a common practice for the manager to ask you to sit at the bar, have a coffee, sit down and start maybe an hour or 2 hours after your scheduled start time, right? And that's a practice that's illegal, and it's very common. At the Worker Solidarity Network, we had this whole educational session, common but illegal practices, and so many of the norms in the restaurant industry, they contravene employment standards law. Which is, I think, from an academic perspective, very interesting to see that interaction between norms and the law on the paper. But being told to sit down and not start work, not given much at all in terms of job security, not having benefits at work, all of these things are shaped by inadequate employment standards law, and then of course their inadequate enforcement too. So that's a huge piece of the puzzle is employment standards law, and I'm looking forward to the next speaker's presentation as well to hear more about labor law and collective agreements and how they could potentially be used to address sexual harassment. So those are a few of the comments I had on your presentation. And then a question that I've been thinking about kind of in relation to this topic and your paper about sexual harassment is whether or not the COVID-19 pandemic has altered the customer is always right mindset. Have we seen any changes in the industry and potential pushback against that framing? I'm really curious about that. I'd love to hear your thoughts afterwards as well. So now just to share a bit about the Worker Solidarity Network. So we are based in British Columbia, and we have offices in Vancouver and Victoria, and we exist to challenge and fight precarious work and fight unjust working conditions, including sexual harassment. And we know that there's an important connection between workplace precarity and human rights. Women, racialized workers, and migrant workers are most likely to be working in precarious work. And at the same time, working in precarious work makes workers more vulnerable to discrimination and harassment on the job. And in order to challenge harassment and discrimination, we also need to then challenge those precarious working conditions that make workers vulnerable or susceptible to facing discrimination at work. And the work of the WSN is very much inspired by the many, many decades of organizing in the rich history of other worker centers that support non-unionized workers, while also working with the labor movement and social justice allies to create systemic change. And at the heart of the Worker Solidarity Network's work is building collective worker power to challenge unjust conditions of work. And I'll share a few examples of our work that we do. We do direct action, worker-led campaigns. And through this work, we try and build a community to come out and support workers who are facing things like wage theft or harassment at work. And direct action could look like, writing a demand letter to an employer, putting the Worker Solidarity Network letterhead on it and trying to get someone's stolen wages back. And if that doesn't work, taking escalating tactics as well, if that is what the person wants. For example, using social media, writing up a story of what happened to the worker, putting it on our website, putting it on Facebook, tagging the employer in it. And we've had real success stories where we've done that, and then within 48 hours, that restaurant that didn't pay the worker during 3 months over summer and said, I'll pay you in the fall, would cut a check for a couple $1,000s. And that direct action is really can be really powerful, especially when trying to work within an employment standard system that is so far backlogged and also, really doesn't work in the interest of workers. So through direct action, we really believe that we can challenge the imbalance of power that exists between employers and workers in non-unionized sites, while bringing attention to the fact that these stories, these experiences aren't just individual narratives, but they really have, impact so many workers, and so many people experience, wage theft or harassment. And we try and build a community of support for folks that way. Worker education is also a part of our big part of our work. So we have a worker justice hotline and emails. But I'll move forward to talk about how we've in our work challenged gender inequality in the workplaces on a broader level. So we do campaign and advocacy work, and we've had a campaign to abolish the liquor server wage, the sub-minimum wage that was ended in June 2021. And this was a huge, huge victory. And we were really, so excited. It took a while, but so excited when it happened. We had petitioned the government. We had, done a whole bunch of street outreach. We had written op-eds to try and draw attention to the connection between gender discrimination and the lower liquor server minimum wage. And finally, a project that I've saved to the very end. It's very, very, I think, special and unique. It's a project called May I, and I'm going to put a link in the chat box to it here. May I is a project that started in 2017 from former and current service industry workers and frontline sexualized violence educators and workers' rights advocates from the WSN. At that time, we were called the Retail Action Network. And this group of individuals came together with the common goal of addressing and preventing sexualized violence in the restaurant industry. And the project started off with focus group sessions with industry workers about sexualized violence. And it evolved into a workshop for industry workers that was done in person and during COVID through webinars. And later, the organizing committee created an online zine to try and spread education about sexualized violence, education about workers' rights, and concrete tactics and strategies that workers have found helpful for coping or supporting coworkers deal with sexual harassment and sexualized violence at work. And so the zine also includes community support contact info, and I'll include a link to it as well in the chat for anyone who wants to check it out. And yeah, the workshop is designed to address and discuss the root causes of sexualized violence and begin a conversation among workers in the restaurant industry about this, persistent problem. So thank you very much. I'll leave my presentation off there and looking forward to our discussion.
Kaitlyn, thank you so much for your comments, both on Taylor's paper, but also these incredible plethora of strategies that Worker Solidarity Network engages that you just shared with us now. I know our next speaker, Andrea, you talked, Kaitlyn, about the fact that you organize these various public actions in order to bring to attention the kinds of sexual harassment and various other problematic practices that take place, so as to support workers in being able to bring those stories up as well, because people don't always feel empowered or in a position to do that. And I know that Andrea has also been very actively engaged in a number of very high-profile cases, or when high-profile cases of sexual harassment in the context of hotel industry were brought to light in sort of 2011 and 2012. I know, Andrea, that you had also, as a shop steward of Unite here at the time, been very active and outspoken about this, and you, alongside other labor activists, took it as an opportunity to really emphasize and bring this issue to attention. So I will turn the floor over to you now, Andrea, to tell us maybe a little bit about your experiences with this issue as a shop steward with Unite here, but also president of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and perhaps some strategies and tactics that you have found effective or tried to alongside other labor activists bring up in order to deal with this issue, albeit in the context of a different sector, because I know that most of your work has been in the context of hotel industry.
Yes, thank you. When I'm listening to the other speakers and just wonder, kind of, it couldn't help but take myself back several years ago as when I just came into the country, started off into the hotel. And I just want to share a little bit of how close to home this is to me. And they always describe, if you work into the hotel and you're at the back of the house, you clean room, they always say the room cleaners are the angriest of all. They're always angry. And it's just it's not just the dirty rooms that you clean, it's some of the crappiest things and the guests that you face that not necessarily want to be saying good morning, but see you as a woman as part of the room that they pay for. And when I started off working into one of the downtown hotel, Toronto hotel, I remember just even my first day going to the orientation, management gather up a group of us and just walk through the lobby. And I couldn't help myself seeing this lovely lobby, and as they walked through the lobby, I always remember the manager said to us, you are our guests as well. So it's not just the guests with the suitcase that walk in here, you are also treated as the guests. And I felt special. I see this lovely lobby and thinking, wow. I never imagined, like on the next day starting at work, I was at the back of the house, like the lobby, no longer. I was told there's an employee entrance somewhere else, you exit, you have to be seen. But what was so strange, like I've seen as a young person going in, I think I was about 18 at that point. I look around and I see a lot of women that could be my mother and my grandmother. I think I was the youngest that was working there at the time. And they work really hard, the disrespect, and management constant reminding them that if you don't like the treatment here, it's a revolving door, go away. And it took me a while to realize that as they were working. And as I got more involved in the union and wanted better for myself, I start to realize why they just work on the sadness in their eyes, because they started to share these stories that they came in to the country, and a lot of them came with different experiences, work skills from their own country, but it wasn't recognized. So the first place and the first stop is into the hotel sector. You don't need a lot of experience. They can train you for most of that. And so you get into these places, and the next step is where management nicely, without showing you that they're segregating you. So you're working and saying hi to your coworkers, but you're set up in a way that doesn't matter what's wrong. It's hard to trust the other coworker to speak out. They segregate. And so as slowly as I start realizing what happened, my shift, I wasn't just as a new person coming in, wasn't a set shift. I was low on the seniority list, so I work either on the AM shift or the afternoon shift. And in that case, I get to work in the evening, where I would go into rooms and turn down the bed, or the guest that phone at the end of the day for some extra amenities in the rooms. And just shock, knocking doors, and that guest is not opening the door, just saying, come in. As I slide my key in, that guest is stark naked on the bed. And I'm not just leaving that robe, or I'm not leaving the blanket. The guest is asking me to come over and tuck him into that bed, or touch this part. And I was shocked. Like, I run back to some of these ladies in the cafeteria. I stop at the supervisor first. I go, what is this? What's going on? And the supervisor said, welcome to the club. And I thought she didn't hear me, and I repeat again what happened. And she said, and I said, welcome to the club. So I left and I went to the cafeteria and I spoke to some of these women. And they said to me, yes, it happened to me. Yes, it happened to me. But what do? I need this job. Where do I go? I'm here for a better life for my family. So we just suck it up. And that makes me angry, because it wasn't a one-day thing. It's more guests was coming. The guests that leave with that kind of experience tell their friends, and their friends keep coming back. And sometimes they seek out the employee that was described to them. And this is what we've gone through over the years. And as I got involved as shop steward and as a chief steward, where that lead me into other departments, I remember like getting into the restaurants where, unfortunately, you see them probably more in the afternoon, coming in for those afternoon when it's busier, or dinner shift. And that's when you see them. But what was interesting, we're working in places where we wear uniform, and their uniform was the strangest fit. So it's not that person that just went out for it because that person want tip and buy certain clothing. The employer actually provide those kind of tacky looking uniform. And every so often, the big guy would show up from somewhere out of town to call this general membership meeting to tell you. And I have a cup, and I look at it just yesterday and smile to myself, because there was 2 cups I remember my time in that hotel. One of them said, smile, talk, anticipate, response. And then the other one says, accommodate the guest needs. I always remember, and I kept that cup. I never give anyone to drink out of it. I kept it. And it was interesting because they meant it. And they would tell us, that guest needs something, you go the extra mile to please the guest. They always say that. And no matter what the guests do, if the guests try to come on to a cleaner, and that cleaner try to be, just to shun on that behalf, it's a chance you don't have a job tomorrow. Because that guest is angry enough to file a complaint, and management won't call you back to hear your side. They just know that you stop a guest that is going to tell a friend not to come. And in that case, the guest will get a fruit basket in the morning that's delivered to the room to apologize for your behavior. Or the guest will get a free meal to apologize for your behavior. And on the guest way out, the guest will phone back or write back. Sometimes they write back saying, is that person still there? Because how dare you shun them off? And in that case, management is saying, I'm sorry, you can't stay. because I need to tell the guests that I got rid of you. And that's how they were able to hold down and muzzle workers who want only to work. And they go through these daily. The servers, the wait staff, who are in the opening, are busy. Imagine after hours where these bars and restaurant get really busy. And that guest who keep shoving his hand up the skirt or doing, how do you openly slap that guest and have a job tomorrow? How do you openly even shout at this guest and have a job tomorrow? It was part of the job. You know, the coworker is not going to assist you because you are the problem that guest not coming back. And with that, it's where they've seen, like, if you're a wait staff, any servers, seen as someone who is uneducated. That's how they saw the servers. The tacky clothes and the free for all, and maybe there's nothing else behind you holding a tray. And throughout those years, my experience seeing that, and that server who come to work and frustrated because of it, and the supervisor who will yank that server in a back room with even myself as a steward to have a chat about their behavior. There was no way around it. I think what was helpful over the years, a few years back, when this continued to escalate to a point where a room cleaner was attacked into a room, beaten and robbed of her chain and everything once that person was done with her on the floor. And the union decided that we need to do something about it. I didn't know much about a union. I know I was in there. I never read a collective agreement. I was just angry, just like the others. And finally, we were called into, we were, before any training happening, and I must go back a little, I remember while I'm on one of these PM shifts, so the day is good, everybody is happy, and you work hard, and you keep an eye at the back of your head, look out for that guest who leave their meeting room and need to come back and read the newspaper, but you become part of the newspaper. And I remember on the afternoon shift, I always walk around the hallway, and this quiet little guy, always, as soon as he see me, his hand was always in my bosom. And I couldn't understand why. Like, every day he looked forward to see me to do that. And I remember walking up to the head of that department, and I was about to complain. And I could, right there, the guy approached. And when I explained what happened, I was reporting what the guy was doing to me. And the worst day of my life, watching, as I didn't even see the guy, he just appeared, was the manager saying to me, she pointed behind me and she said, that little guy there, he couldn't harm a fly. And the guy had the biggest grin on his face when I turned around. The biggest grin, like she just gave him a license to do whatever he wants with me at night. And I remember that night, it was 11 p.m. that night. I was in a linen, a chemical room, refilling my bottles for my AM shift. And I remember hearing that door slam behind me. I turned around, and by then he wasn't just touching anymore. He was ripping my clothes in my bosom, and he wake. And all I remember doing, lifting my leg, and I gave him the hardest kick under his groin. And he just doubled over, and I left him in that room. I actually locked the door. And I said, you better explain what you had for dinner that's upsetting your stomach tonight when they see you. But we ended up, the union called a press conference and invited a number of these HR directors and general managers from a number of these hotels. And we ended up with a few flight attendants that came and told their stories of sexual harassment into the sector. And nobody prepped me. I've never shared this story with my union. And I remember standing and listening, and I approached the media to talk about what happened to me there. And I saw the face of the general manager, the HR director, the ones that left during that time came over and asked me if this happened within their time, because they were afraid that now that somebody dared to open to the press about what was inside, that they now have to answer. And everyone, was it in my time? Was it in my time? You know, and I was happy because that led us to have a sit down with a number of hotels, including the one I was in, Central, to start off sexual harassment training for the servers and sexual harassment training for the room cleaners. The employer agreed, because it was so many of us, to give different slot of time to release them from work so they could go through this training. And with that help, they came up with suggestion of jamming your cart in front of a guest room door, which we thought was crazy. Was crazy, because all the guests do on the other end of the cart is shove it the other way, come in and slide it back, and nobody know what's happening to you. And a lot of different recommendations, but in the end, the whistle, the bell, we came to some agreement that if you work in the daytime and you're not feeling safe, walk away. If the guests walk in, doesn't matter the condition of that room, just walk away. If you work in at night or even early in the evening and you're a PM shift person, you don't feel like you want to go up on that floor by yourself because it's quieter in the evening, the company need to buddy you up with somebody else to go. And a lot of manager comes and go and fight to take that away from the women. A lot of them, as a shop steward, in always going there to say, what is this? Like, as a woman, as a manager, why do you think that you need to see it carved in stone that it's right, you know? And oftentimes doing that. So I'm sad in a way that it's not in a collective agreement, but it's understood. And I think, so it's always the learning process for people coming in to say you have that right. But to go a little bit further with Bill 168, violence in the workplace, was also helpful because they, when it just came in, the company gather people up and say, okay, sign here, sign here. I gave you a copy of it, or they put it up on a little board in the cafeteria, and that was the training on it. But with more support and with the union continue to push them to say that it's not a gloves, that's where you need to make sure you're looking at every department and take a look at what's unsafe in there. And for us, as we have health and safety committee, to help to educate workers that you have a right. It doesn't matter if you're a server, you don't have to get burned or cut. Once you feel unsafe, you have a right to remove yourself. Removing is important, but I think it's the other part of it is to make sure somebody at the other end is making sure that you're safe. It's not to not show up at work the next day because you can't take it anymore. It's making sure that you're safe and to set the tone to the customer that your body is not a part of what they paid for. And the respect that go with it. So, you know, I'd say over time, like, we're slowly getting there, but not as far as we want to. And not as far as where a guest need to show up at the restaurant knowing that I'm not paid enough. So for me to get the tip, I need to be everything for you, you know, and that's part of what they use as to exploit. When Dominic Strauss-Kahn's story came out, and I remember the Toronto Star was the first to call to say, hey, you know, this is happening in America. I don't think it happened in Canada. And, you know, as a steward, tell me. And I said, yes, it does. And we talk about my own stories and other bigger hotels downtown. I remember workers coming back saying that they were gathered, management gathered them quickly into these meetings and say, you never tell. This secret never leave this wall. Imagine, so if, you know, whether you're a server or cleaning room, and management is saying to workers, you never tell. So those workers not saying anything, because the first name will release, then they're going to find some way to get rid of them, because now you're preventing them from getting business. So in a way, I think it also forced their hands to start to look at some of their policies that they have in place. That policy, it's not just about discrimination, you know, or just any violence, but to look at sexual harassment, who's also accountable and putting some in place. And for us, how we continued that education to make sure people are speaking up and make sure that we continue to build on what we already have, that it's not just on a piece of paper. You know, call them on it, call the GM on it. Did you just post it? Do you know anything that's on that paper? And to make sure that we can continue to push, whether we lobby in the government. It's not about just a Bill 168 or a policy. We need to, how do we make sure management is going backward and looking at when you train people? Did you train me 20 years ago and assume that all this is, you know, do you train people with different language that you don't just by signing the paper rather than getting somebody to help to translate and making sure that they understand, you know? But I'll shut up, and, you know, but that's my take on this. Like, it doesn't matter where it is, it's just where, once, if you're not at the front desk working, and if you're not a guy, whether you're using tools, and as women and you're back there, or you're in that restaurant or bar, it's almost like a target for something. You know, there's a reason why you're at this bar, and there's a reason why the others are at the back of the house. They're immigrants, they're women, and exploitation. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you very much for sharing these stories, including your own stories, in such a candid way, and also talking a little bit about the various ways in which the union was, you know, able to push on management to expand kind of the interpretation of the right to refuse, for example, to also include those situations, but, you know, also put in place some policies that, and you know, put some pressure on management to actually uphold the policies that they have, because as we know from research, there are various rights that workers and employees or employees already have, but enforcement of these rights is often very much a problem. And the problem of, and it starts within the workplace. It starts also with kind of the fact that so much onus is placed on the employees to make complaints, to bring them up to management, you know, and I think that sort of connects with some of the things that Taylor was speaking about at the beginning as well, the kind of the emphasis that's placed on employees to make complaints and also determine what is reasonable and not reasonable, and when, and to give consent to certain or not consent to certain kinds of behaviors. So I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm not going to speak. I know that Kaitlyn articulated some comments and also invited Taylor to respond, but I also see some hands up, so perhaps I will leave it to you to decide if we should go to Taylor for some brief response, or should we go to questions first, and then perhaps Taylor, you can speak with Kaitlyn also as time allows. How should we go about this? I'm moderating, so I should make the decision, I suppose. But perhaps should we try to hear from others first? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. And I can see that Kathy has her hand up. Sorry.
Hello, thank you for a lovely set of presentations and laying out really what's at stake. I have two questions, so pardon me. One is, Andrea, you talked about the way that management subtly separated workers from each other. And I wondered whether Kaitlyn and Taylor, you could talk about that a little bit in the restaurant industry, whether that's also the case. It feels to me like there's a very strong hierarchy. I've never worked as a waitress or, but the kitchen staff, but the cooks and the dishwashers, the servers, the hosts, the waitresses, and just kind of what possibilities are there for solidarity among these groups of people who sometimes seem to be also at each other's throats in a sense, or not always cooperating or have a sense of being better than another. And in which there are also divisions of gender and ethnicity, perhaps. I don't know. That's my sense of it. And the second question is, I had assumed when Kaitlyn and Taylor were speaking that this was a case of sort of persistent sexual harassment, but with multiple actors, right? Where customers were sort of coming in and out, and it was different people. And then Andrea made me wonder, well, maybe these are persistent customers. These are customers who come back. And then that sort of places a different, it makes me think differently about what management's role should be, maybe, but maybe it shouldn't. So I'm just wondering about the turnover in the customers and whether the feeling of this is a one-off event because this is someone we may never see again, in a sense. Does that impact how restaurants are responding to this, or is it really there are repeat customers, and it's anyway, just how, I guess I'm just wondering about who's seen as the source of this. Thank you.
Okay. Did you want me to respond?
Please, yes, all of you can respond in whatever order.
Yes. So, I'll touch a little bit on separating the workers. There are times when the hiring process happen and they're careful. Management are very careful how they hire. You're not just lucky. Over the years, it slowly shifted to a coworker who's mouthy and gonna be fighting all the time. And once that person leave, they make sure that they as they hire someone else, it's someone who a little bit quieter, you know, on that side. And as soon as this person started to speak up, then they'll go, my, this person shocked me. I never thought this person could be like that, you know, mouthy, very quick. And so they want to see people who are frail, work hard and aim to please and suffer inside. That's what they're looking for. And at the same time, there's a competition with this industry. They compete with the other hotel down the street for the carpet on the floor, the size mattress. As they design these restaurants and bar, they compete. They're actually competing. They're not just spending the money. So they want to lure customer to them. So the one guest that show up there and get really and overly excited in that restaurant, and so it's very rare you'll see security shoving that person out on the street like that. They'll find different ways to comfort that person, you know, and hopefully that person will sober up and remember their way back to that place. But what they rely on, that once that customer leave, they're telling somebody else of their experience. So it's almost a rolling advertisement for their business. So that customer is not just saying, hey, I went to that bar and goodness, the staff was great. They're talking about some of what they shouldn't be doing and prohibited. I get to relax, have my beer and all of that, and you should check out that chick that's down there. So when the other person turn up, they're looking for that person. I know of times when guests would show up and they actually go to other worker to say, where is Andrea, or where is this person? Because they figure out their schedule, or the other one tell the other one their schedule. The experience of room attendant who happen to clean a room where the room attendant that work there is off for some reason, and her back is turned and suddenly it's a hand up under her clothes. And when she turn around, the guests go, oh, it's not you. So this is regular guests that turn up and have their way, and it's the same person, and they keep getting away until finally. So this segregation of worker, they segregate by language too. If I am the mouthy one that will say, hey, you know, like you shouldn't, they make sure they take that person in the cafeteria and say, you should sit over there. Sit over there. Don't worry with those one, they're troublemaker. So it takes a while for people to understand that, no, it's about them making sure that you're not able to have the support to speak up. And I mean, if we look closely to some of the programs that they have, whether it's a safety bingo, you know, health and safety. If someone is hurt, whether it's your body or certain things that you report, as they put up the chart for winning, you win a TV, you win something, and now somebody report. the rest of the coworkers are going to say, you're bad, like you cost us that TV, because the number go down. So there's different ways to make sure people feel like, I can't report what's happening because my coworker now is going to blame me for not getting that TV, you know, that mental stress. The employer is working hard to make sure they get the check at the end of the year from WSIB for having no lost days. So, and one of the HR said to me, Andrea, I don't have to do anything to that worker who's complaining. I just leave them to their coworker. Their coworker will get at them for blaming for whatever they didn't achieve. So that's a lot of, when you don't get to know your coworker, and the importance of the union playing a role to make sure that we are building this network with workers, that we understand each other. And I always say, you don't have to speak my language for us to understand that we are in the same struggle and we can fight together to get out of it.
Kaitlyn and Taylor, feel free to respond.
I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. For the first part, I think absolutely there is also segregation in the restaurant industry, and you see that deliberately through the hiring process and placing people in certain roles and positions. So, you know, you have the front of house, which is normally the bartenders and the servers and the hosts, and then you have the back of house where there's line cooks, dishwashers, and the bussers. And so you see that normally the people at the front of house are women, white women, you know, and the people at the back of house are usually men, racialized workers. So there's this deliberate relegation of racialized workers to the back of house, out of sight from the customers who are in the front of house with the white workers who are serving them. And yeah, as Andrea was saying, I think this is deliberate through hiring processes, and it does create a hierarchy. I know there's a lot of like jokes in the restaurant about, you know, there's a lot of hostility between different roles. You know, I was both a host and a server, and I did to go. And when I was a host, it was like the hosts hated the servers hated the hosts. You know, we have all this kind of hostility. So I think that's not so much inevitable, but created. And so that there is less solidarity. There is less working together to see how this is affecting everyone. In terms of organizing, maybe Kaitlyn could speak more to that. And then for the second question, I think it depends. I mean, I think it happens that customers come in and they're just, you know, a random customer on that day, and they, you know, perpetrate sexually harassing behaviors towards servers and employees. But there's also instances where these are regular customers who come in, and, you know, in my interviews with servers in Ottawa, you know, that came up where there would be regulars, what they call regulars, that come into the restaurant repeatedly, and they would harass the servers, and they would talk to the owner or the manager, and they would say, well, we're not going to do anything about it because they bring in so much money for the restaurant, so you're just going to have to suck it up. And I think Andrea made a really good point that, you know, in the restaurant, like, alcohol is a big factor to this. Consuming alcohol can cause people to act differently, and so I think that also needs to be a consideration with sexual harassment training, in terms of how to respond to that. Because I know, and again, in my interviews, the server said, you know, a lot of these conflicts that I had with customers happened after I cut them off. After I cut them off of alcohol, this happened. So definitely something to consider.
Maybe one thing Andrea and Taylor already spoke to, you know, the hiring practices, and that how that is segregating and causes divide. And one comment maybe I'll add is around the tipping system, and I think how the tipping system intensifies that divide as well, and the fact that, you know, For example, tip pooling is legal, but there isn't any anything in the law in BC in employment standards that says that tip pooling practices have to be transparent, or that workers have to be involved in creating and consenting to that tipping, tip pool system. It's all kind of happens behind the scenes. And I think the tip pooling system creates this tension between back of house and front of house workers as well, especially when it's run by management, rather than something that's collectively decided by workers. For example, we know that through hearing from workers, concerns of the Worker Solidarity Network, that when minimum wage goes up, some of the practices that employers use, like increasing, a server's portion to the tip pool in order to cover the minimum wage increase, of course, that's going to create hostility and divide amongst workers, right? Rather than them, doing other things to offset their labor costs. So the fact that I think there's no transparency in terms of who gets how much, and that workers, there isn't a collective, unless you're in a unionized restaurant, there isn't a collective of workers made up of back of house workers and front of house workers who decide how the tip pool is like equally distributed. I think that causes a lot of hostility between workers in that way. And then I wanted to say, about your comment around solidarity and acts of solidarity. I remember from my interviews, hearing of ways that workers support each other. Like, for example, if there was a customer who regularly harassed one worker, that their coworker would take over serving them, right? So that person didn't have to see them again. Or coworkers would support each other, and these are like everyday kind of like small tactics that happen in the immediate sense. Or workers getting together and having a laugh and like using humor to like cope with a comment that a customer says, and to show solidarity with each other by laughing at that customer, for example. Those are some small acts, but I think really meaningful acts of coworker solidarity that I heard about. Yeah, thanks for your question.
Thank you for all these, all these answers, and continuing and expanding our discussion. I see a question in the chat from Yuri for Taylor specifically. Yuri asks, Taylor, how would you like to expand on your research on this topic in the future? And are there any aspects of the research that you talked about here today that you cut for time purposes that you would like to maybe expand on? So I'll let you go with that.
Sure, thank you, Yuri. I definitely think, my thesis research is more so on the job requirements of servers in the food service industry, and kind of this implicit discrimination that employers are displaying in their hiring practices. So I definitely think in the future, I would like to do, more comprehensive research about like this prevalence of sexual harassment. It wasn't the focus of my thesis research, even though it came up. It would be interesting to do more qualitative interviews with that in mind specifically, and maybe see the other methods that, servers have for dealing with that together, coping with that, as Kaitlyn said, kind of coming up with these methods to work together when managers and employers are not protecting them or doing what they're supposed to do. And then, I think something that I would want to mention that my thesis research is about is looking at this concept of aesthetic labor, and seeing how employers in the food service industry and retail industries commodify embodied dispositions of workers in order for corporate gain. So, it's like the servers essentially become an extension of the product that the restaurant is selling. And I think Andrea, made a really good point earlier when she talked about being part of the room that the guest was buying. You've basically become this object in the service transaction. And so that is also something that is stratified along lines of gender, race, class. And so that's something that I've looked at in my research and seen, how do these hiring practices contribute to that, and what, because it's obviously not legal to discriminate on these bases, but employers are still doing it implicitly with the way that they recruit people to work in restaurants, with the way that they interview, and with the job requirements that they assign to certain people in the restaurant. So through all of these methods, they're upholding these gendered and racialized divisions. And so I think that's another aspect where it can translate into sexual harassment and sexualization, especially when these servers are being objectified and treated as a part of this service transaction. So those are just some things I want to mention. Thank you for the question.
Taylor, it strikes me that you talk about your future research or on aesthetic labor, and I guess, and I was just thinking that in addition to sort of personal dispositions that employers will kind of select for, dress codes, which is something that came up in a number of presentations today. Dress codes are another way in which this is, this particular gender coding of work, but also sexualization of particular jobs is perpetrated. And Andrea spoke about this, and I'm sorry, I forget now if it was Kaitlyn. I think Kaitlyn, you talked about this as well, or perhaps it was Taylor too. Sorry, I'm going to stop. I interject too much. Are there any other questions or comments from our participants in the audience? We still have a few minutes. I don't see any comments or questions for the moment. So perhaps Taylor, would you or any of you, would you like to perhaps respond to, is there anything else you would like to add? Taylor, would you perhaps like to respond to the comments that you received from Kaitlyn earlier in regard to your with regards to your paper? We have a few minutes, so we can continue having a chat.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say, Kaitlyn, thank you so much for your comments and considerations. I really appreciate it. I think your question was kind of, how has COVID-19 pandemic possibly affected the attitude of the customer is always being right, and if it's persisted? I think it depends, because if we're looking at the United States, I would say that it might have made it worse because, a lot of these employees were being expected to continue going to work with no sort of sick leave, no sort of break throughout the pandemic because nothing really closed. So, in a way, it added another facet to the customer is always right, because you're kind of putting yourself at risk, really, of bodily harm, injury, and illness further in serving people. And in the U.S., one of the highest worker mortality rates during the pandemic was for line cooks in restaurants, and we saw that a couple of studies have seen that racialized workers had a higher risk of dying from COVID-19 during the pandemic. So again, it's stratified. However, I do think in Canada, there have been, it's specifically in Toronto, I've heard of a couple of restaurants who, because of the pandemic and because of the way that it affected like everyone economically. It affected people's disposable income, so people didn't have as much money to tip. Some of the restaurants in Toronto, the restaurant owners decided to establish and enforce gratuity. So they just added the gratuity to the check already. So the customer couldn't decide, oh, I'm going to tip this much, whatever. They enforce that gratuity so that the employees would be able to have that like regardless. And I think that's kind of the method that some restaurants have used. I definitely think, the COVID-19 pandemic has provided an opportunity to think about how tipping, the mechanism of tipping affects people and how precarious the work of service workers is, especially in, Ontario and other provinces in Canada where restaurants were closed for so long. So many restaurants have closed permanently. And so a lot of restaurant workers were even their livelihoods were even more uncertain because they didn't know when they were going to have work again. They didn't know when they were going to go back. And then those who were, expected to keep working faced possibly getting COVID at work. So it's a lot of uncertainty, but I think it presents the opportunity to look at the model and say, okay, this is what is wrong here. These are the inequalities we're witnessing. Now, how can we move forward to better protect these workers and provide them with more benefits, paid leave, sick leave, all those kinds of things.
I'm mindful of the time, so I think I'm going to slowly move towards wrapping up this session. The issues we have been discussing, we've been focusing primarily on hospitality industry, restaurants and hotels, and sexual harassment and precariousness that, but also strategies for resisting these in the context of these sectors. But Jane earlier drew my attention to a recent survey that Canadian Labour Congress conducted, because there's quite a lot of data on the prevalence of sexual harassment at work in US context. And there is obviously data in Canada as well. I mean, Kaitlyn's research has contributed to this, but the CLC did a major survey together with the University of Toronto and University of Western Ontario. And the results of this survey are really dismal. They didn't focus just on hospitality industry. Their focus was much broader. And some of the figures are really depressing. They suggest that 7 in 10 workers in Canada experience violence or harassment at work, and 1 in 2 experienced some form of sexual harassment in the last 2 years. So those are really very damning statistics, suggesting all that much strongly that we need to really look at this issue closely and continue to look at it. And Kaitlyn, you already drew attention to the fact that this is a long-term problem that's been written about for quite a while. And the fact that we are still in this situation with those sorts of recent statistics is really a significant issue. On that slightly dismal note, although you've also highlighted different ways in which workers themselves take action to resist these, I wanted to say thank you to all of you for contributing your personal and professional and activist and scholarly expertise and stories. It was really wonderful and very enriching. And I also wanted to thank all of those folks who joined us today to listen and ask questions and comment. So thank you again, and please be on the lookout for future events that the Work and Labor program is going to put on, but also the Institute of Political Economy more generally. So thank you again, and I hope you have a good day. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.